Welcome to the new Cyber Frontier, bringing you the latest news and initiatives that focus on the development of cybersecurity economics. You don't have to be a computer or cybersecurity expert to get plugged in. Your host brings it straightforward, asks the tough questions, and brings the cyber world to a level of understanding for everyone. You can find us on the web at www.newcyberfrontier.com. Now join our host as he introduces the topic for today's new Cyber Frontier.
Welcome to today's episode of New Cyber Frontier. On today, we have Dominic Paulo. Again, this is our second take with Dominic, and we continued on with the conversation after our last recording, and it was just so good that I had to start rolling again. We put together this second show for you, and I think this and these conversations with Dominic give a good connection to what kind of the average person might hear, think when they come into the experience with New Cyber Frontier or introduced the first time with the products and the thought process, the theory behind what we do here at Blockframe and with New Cyber Frontier. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to bring you in now on this conversation already in progress.
But it's something that we could put a number to, and we could actually make a comparison to something like blockchain, right? Like, so we can do this comparative analysis and say, people have this perception that if I'm using blockchain, that I'm destroying, the Amazon. But I think the reality of that is that we're all destroying the Amazon. We're looking at cat pictures all day long. And I think if you put these things in proportion, it makes someone like myself who's like, I have no idea what the operational cost of serving my favorite cat picture versus having some service do like my energy to have a contract. Like, so for example, I have a meter at the house, right? It writes a particular usage and my account number, and then it sends it off to some server somewhere. And then there's a transaction, right? So we can put a fixed transaction from the meter to the place for it to go through. What is the entire transactional cost? And I think proportionizing that would make it a little easier for an end user like myself to wonder, like, well, how much? What is proportional, energy use for this, right?
That's interesting. I've seen some studies on energy usage, and how it impacts the person that would be aware of how much energy they're using. And the unfortunate results of that are each little piece of your contemplatable operation usage, whatever you're doing, is so minuscule. It doesn't affect your psychological use of energy. It's not until you see the combination of it all on a bill or on a day or whatever. So it's more of a, what did I do during this time that caused that high energy, than it is how much energy does this task take.
Yeah, and I think part of that is finding the right example, right? Like, so my particular cat image thing may not put it in the right scope and context, right? Like, again, you start to talk to people about like deep time in geology, and they just, what is 50 million years, right? Like, so you have to be able to contextualize it in a way that the end user is going to say, like, oh, okay, so a week's worth of, laundry or whatever. Again, that's part of like that science communication part, and putting it in a form that has an impact, and you can make and so again, this is kind of where you get into like the statistical problems, is people don't make apples to apples comparisons. They're doing these really disingenuous comparisons, but from a perspective of advocating of, clear communication so people can make good decisions, I think there are definitely ways of contextualizing that information that is, again, very mimetic for your end user. And I think so much of the world that we're in right now is about finding ways to, again, I've heard a number of people that come from academia, and they say, there's a lot of brilliant people, but there aren't that many brilliant people that can take a really complicated thing and break it down into something that every average person could understand. That requires like that second tier of mastery. And I feel like with these types of issues, you really need someone who lives and breathes this in a way that can communicate this to your average layperson, in order for it to be effective in a way that will move the needle on policy, right? Like, because I would imagine the big part of this is you're driving policy change. You're trying to get people to hopefully vote or make decision, the economics of their choices in line with some larger vision. But if it's so abstract, like that's where we are today. Like I couldn't communicate anything meaningful about blockchain or energy uses, or even just like if we're just talking like the standard, what does it cost to operate a router, an internet server, and all of the things that make the internet work as it exists today. Like, right.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't communicate that in a meaningful way to a family member if I were trying to explain to them like, yeah, the internet has a transactional cost, and in order to run the servers, it's not free. Like, there's a reason why they sell you as a product to keep everything going. You got to pay internet service fees and all,
Yeah.
all of these things that keep the infrastructure going.
So, I'll put something in perspective that I heard recently, and this is from we'll say, a very reliable source and a company that sells servers. And basically, with the new boom of AI, the amount of usage of computational resources is way more than even cryptocurrency mining. They basically, one of the large server companies representative says, we have more servers on order for delivery on back order in the San Francisco Bay area than the infrastructure of power will support.
It does not surprise me. I mean, we're always at a sort of a disadvantage from my point of view of like infrastructure, right? I was in Arizona for 10 years. And so they'd have these rural areas that were county islands, cost nothing to build houses there, right? Like, and so some of that opportunity cost for the people who want to move in was there's no road for infrastructure. There's no power infrastructure. There's no police infrastructure, right? So they're selling people on this dream and they're saying like, you could have this house. It'll cost a third or half of what you might spend in a major metropolitan market. There ain't stuff out there. Good luck driving home every day in the long line of, 2 hours of cars. And I feel like that's kind of often where we are with infrastructure projects here in Colorado, right? Like CDOT delayed for from what I've read, like a decade or longer in terms of like critical road infrastructure. We're finally seeing that happen, right? And I think it's really hard. Part of like the policy side is nobody wants to be the first in. Nobody wants to put and budget and allocate to say, I'm going to do the difficult thing with all of the political risk that comes along with it and say, yeah, I'm going to put all of this money into internet servers because I know this emergent technology with AI, like we could do the math. Like there's a lot of brilliant people. You gave them the numbers, they could crank out the math and tell you what the computational resource is. Like that's not a difficult problem to solve. The challenge is once you give all that person to a decision maker, are they going to pull the trigger? Are they going to push the button to say, we need the servers, we need to build up the energy infrastructure, blah, 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 all the logistics things that need to be brought online, right?
Yeah, I mean, along the same line with energy infrastructure, the one of the large utility companies in California, I heard them say directly, it wasn't to me, but in a gathering that we can support about 12 to 15% saturation of people having electric vehicles. We're at about 8% right now is what they said. And at 12%, we have infrastructure problem. At 15%, we can't support beyond that. And the political landscape is get as many as we can, transfer everybody over. And it's just, there's things that are not going to work. And the people making the decisions that everybody needs to be on an electric car aren't aware of this or are ignoring it, or it's politically like down the road far enough that I just don't have to think about it.
Yeah. And again, like a lot of things that you talked about in your dissertation, this idea of there's a fixed amount of data that anyone is going to be able to warehouse as you build these ledgers out, right? Like, so one of the interesting things that you talked about was the side chaining, right? Like I didn't get deep into that, but I was fascinated by this idea of being able to, I guess you could say, like modularize the production of blockchain so that you'd have like, the 3 tiers that you guys talked about in, I can't remember the name of the project, but what you guys were laying out is sort of like the bottom tier where it's doing these, separate transactions. And so that way they could be efficient and you're basically creating this parallel infrastructure. So you're not just bottlenecking it through one place, right? Like,
that's the main premise. You
Unix design philosophy, right? Like I think, you have the cathedral and the bazaar, right? Like you go back to that old book. And there are different advantages for different things. And anytime you're scaling something out, it generally seems to be that you want to have a very modular approach, right? Like, and so you're talking about like doing upgrades and all of the other things that come in line. Like, I mean, like I was thinking about rollback. I was thinking about authentication. Like there are just, this is math, like the scale of it boggles the mind, right? Like there's a lot of engineer time that's going to be devoted to making this thing go, which is fascinating and to be at the beginning of it. I guess I just think that before that happens, it would be nice to see some structure in place, right? Like I always go back to Asimov's robotics, right? His 3 rules of robots, right? Like that is so crystallized that if you talk about robots, people immediately, even if they don't know who Asimov is, right? Like they know the 3 rules of robotics on some way, like do no harm, blah, blah, blah. Like I almost wouldn't be surprised if Google took it from, Asimov in some way, right? Like, and so
Have you? Just something. Have you heard? They put an AI onto medical, basically predicting the medical treatment for people, and basically taking what doctors made a decision on for prediction for treatment and running the same information through an AI to say what would the machine say is the best thing. And the biggest part that was like, oh no, we can't do this, is the machine ignored the morality of what we're allowed to do to humans to protect themselves. So are we allowed to put them in a coma for 6 months so they heal up? Because that's the best way to protect them from being further damaged during this treatment plan.
And I think, so there's a lot of really interesting people that have, I'm thinking of Hannah Fry, right? Like she's this mathematician who talks about the implementation of neural networks. And so she covered a lot of these topics. She was talking about how judges have used these before in terms of sentencing guidelines, which didn't work as anyone intended, right? Like the training data was very limited and therefore it had biases in that training data, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like to surprise to nobody. And I think that there is like this, so my worry is that, again, from like in the human condition, we are often in a position where we abdicate responsibility, right? Like we want to find an expert. I don't know how you get that out of human beings. It's just a thing that we do. So, when you have these expert systems, people immediately think like there's magic going on underneath this, like the way that people treat AI and I guess I feel like right now, like a lot of the AI discussions that are taking place around like college campuses and stuff, like they all just completely missed the point. Like kids are going to use AI. Like that's a done deal. That horse is out of the barn. You're never going to get that back in. Like you have to restructure the way that we educate people because they're never going to stop using it. I get frustrated because it's like, there needs to be someone out there who's thinking about these things in a way that is more comprehensive. So I guess I just feel like we can't abdicate to expert machines our human responsibilities, right? Like this is the humanistic part of it. So when you had judges actually using these large language models or neural networks as a way of deciding sentencing guidelines, like that's unethical, it's immoral, and it leads to a class of people that are being given sentences strictly based on things like they couldn't have chosen, right? Like what skin color they have, right? Like that's just not a thing that we can do. And so if you're talking about medical treatments, right, the useful side of it is like, okay, so we can have a machine screen for breast cancer, right? If we got a lot of great training data, it can go through the training data incredibly fast, but we still need to have humans vet this, right? Like, and that human component is never going to go away. And so for me, part of it is creating the design philosophy so that people understand that, right? Like they go into an understanding like, yes, we can use this expert technology, but we can't use it as a way of like abdicating our humanity. Because if we do, the machine has no humanity. We haven't gotten to that point yet. So there still needs to be humans.
How would, if we couldn't tell the difference between a decision made by a human and the results of an artificial intelligence result or production of a decision, a data or whatever, just think of it as data in, data out. And now we have a set of data out produced by who, we can't tell, and we can't tell the difference. Now, we've
So
advocated without even being aware of it.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, essentially, again, go back to 3 laws of robotics, right? Like you have to have these core principles. Um, Another subject that reminds me very similar is when we're thinking about gene editing, right? Like we have CRISPR-9, CRISPR-14. We have all of these new editing tools, right? But we recognize that if we do sort of just boutique or superficial gene editing, like there are other attached segments that we're going to change that we have no idea what we're doing. And so if we want to have sort of any position to stand on, we kind of have to understand those underlying mappings before we move forward, right? And that's a very gray area. And so when we're talking about how is this implemented as far as like computer technology goes, I mean, I think it's very much the same thing. There are certain things that you can throw into a black box. Again, this is what I did, algorithmic models, right? Like, so you have a thing that's predicting the direction of the stock market. Perfectly fine to throw into a black box, right? The risk and appetite for that isn't someone's life. It isn't the some kind of statutory thing where they're being thrown in jail. But when you're considering it being used for those applications, like you need to be able to disentangle what that neural network has done. And we're not there. I mean, everyone will tell you it's like, it's just a black box. Nobody knows.
So have you ever heard the concept of data lineage?
I'm not familiar with that.
Being able to tell your data in, data out, your garbage in, garbage out, your valuable data in, valuable data out, where things come from, where they're produced, how they transition, who's touched them, the whole basically like supply chain of one piece of data is data lineage.
Like chain of custody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically.
So how would how does that come into play with the idea of perhaps like a black box?
So basically, what do you put into the black box? What do you get out of it? And how do you know that it was something that went in or something that went out? So, and what are the black boxes? Do we need to know what the black boxes are? Are they AI? Are they people? So, and do we need to, we don't care if it's a black box. We just need to know that that black box was AI and this black box is human or something we can rely on being from people. And how it was transitioned. Was it altered? Was the meme added to by 5 people since it was created? And who was the original author of the concept? Who gets ownership rights? All that falls in the data lineage. You think of chain of custody is more of a supply chain thing to it. Data lineage is kind of the term for the virtual error. Where does it come from? Where is it processed? Where is it saved? How often is it changed? Who changed it? What did they do to it?
I guess so. So my questions there is, can data lineage? It's like, I guess you'd like an event horizon, right? Like it goes into the black box. Is there a way of knowing what data goes in and being able to understand where it comes out the other end? Like, does the black box transform this idea of data lineage in a way that is one way, right? Like in a ciphertext, you put it through, and once it's through, there isn't really a way of connecting the in and the output, right? Like, and it's way beyond my understanding of philosophy, like the philosophy of computer science.
I guess the truth is, that it's not really defined yet what you're talking about, but it is absent. And it is something that has become more and more transparently needed. Basically, that's what we focus on top of our technology, is the ability to start the process of data lineage. And think of it in terms of blockchain, why it was so fashionable, why everybody signed on, is because it gave them that with their finances. It gave you financial transaction data lineage. It was the first time that we saw that without a third party that could take it into the doors of a bank. And what happened in that black box? You lost all visibility.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that's a feature that, even though people don't realize that's what they want in cryptocurrency, that's what they want.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. So my wife works as an analyst in a bank. I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the stuff that goes on there. And that's actually one of the areas I thought would be pretty interesting, is blockchain as it applies to finance, specifically like thinking about banks and their ledgers. She deals a lot with bank ledgers all day long. So she's dealing with constant transactions. And for me, that idea of data lineage, as you're talking about, as it perhaps is created on the blockchain, is something that I think is of intense interest, potentially the banking industry as a whole. But again, it's like,
And I always thought, our initial term or way to look at it isn't not for the banking industry, is in energy and in digital supply chain, like what software is on what devices, what supplied data, like in the records for government records. That was one of their big things. Is we throw all users in the state's data into one big database. We're just making a hacker target. And literally, they have every fingerprint that you do in the state in one database. And my business partner is an ex-senator of Colorado. And he's like, that's the scariest thing they ever saw when the legislators started looking at that. And they're like, well, who has access to that? And they're like, well, that's just to verify people's election results. But now the state has the ability to lose everybody in the state's biometrics.
Well, and I think the most worrying part for, again, your average citizen is the fact that that may happen and we may not be aware of it for months, years, right? Like that information gets out. And again,
the lineage part is the state has to prove to you as the individual what they've done, who's touched it, and what the data lineage of that data is. And that's where a lot of this work that we do started, is the state of Colorado said, hey, we want to be responsible to our citizens for how we handle their data.
Well, and I imagine, again, the model that you're standing up can be, again, it's data agnostic. So you could really just throw anything into this. And so once you have it stood up, you can just reiterate through this, change the set dressing, and it applies to it just a ton of different things. And again, once you get it off the ground, you can check how robust it is. You can have people banging on it and try to break it and all the other things. And again, go through the iterations of making this something that is robust enough to be a publicly available, utility or app or, So, I mean, I think that's honestly like the big promise of this. And again, I think the fascinating part there that is maybe interesting to your end user is the fact that it changes their relationship with their governing structures, right? Like we're used to having a very particular relationship where it goes from one direction primarily. We show up, we do our ritual of voting, but we don't really have any way of following up and checking besides, again, to go online and to try to look things up is incredibly difficult when you're talking about like what the government is doing on a citywide level. But I think people will be more interested in their own personal data. And again,
that's actually our point, is follow the personal data, make everything surround the individual, and then have the agencies, the governments, the companies start to eventually realize that, hey, people will support companies that do that versus my data model, which we just take everything everybody gives us, dump it into a big blob, and we sell that for people to search and get metrics on your uses, which is literally, that's the big data approach. That's why, social media, I won't name any names of companies, are still free. Where do you think they get the money for your free service?
Yeah, you are the product being sold. Absolutely. Like that's, again, anybody who's into technology is kind of like, yeah. And again, I just
give that away. I'm used to that. I have no control. I never will. But that's, if I leave a legacy, it's that I changed that right there. That now there is a way, whether you choose to or not, to have individual control.
And honestly, I think we're at like a really great inflection point for making that message. I mean, for the farce that is them banning TikTok, right? Like, I've always been thinking about this sort of distributed model, a la Napster, a la, when you have, these separate pools of how, like, what would Facebook look like if the way that you stored information was granular to the end user level, that it wasn't settings on a server that was deciding where your information went out. There was a very easy to use API that just had a bunch of your own personal settings. And then the actual software had to go and had to talk to what your personal settings were, right, to decide what your comfort level with disseminating any of this information is, right? Like, and it's constantly hitting up against your own personal settings. So it's not every time you're
that's
hitting
what we're
something.
doing with the digital privacy initiative. We're actually looking at, can we start that? That would be, if that's the end goal, right? How many years out is that? We don't care. But there's pieces that have to exist. Like the first step would be, if the user's going to do something, maybe put some icons up that show them what that would do to their privacy. This here will leave your privacy open in a pool of bigger researchers, of bigger access. This one is going to expose your friend's privacy along with your actions. And little, just tagging it, so when people go to do something, some little icon could give them a pictograph of what they're doing, because right now they don't know. And they don't think about it because there's nothing that says, oh, let me enforce. But we can, as developers, we can say, oh, every time you go to tag somebody in a picture, you are doing this to their trends and patterns. You're identifying implied behavior, not only of you over time, but of your friends' implied behavior. And an icon could say, you're opening up implied behavior of your friends if you're going to click this. Or you're opening up trendic behavior, implied behavior of yourself. And two little icons could show what you're doing. But to start the process of defining and identifying is step one to being able to say, okay, now we're going to make them ask before they do it, even if they're doing it in the back end with your data. But all good.
And I think that's all critical, right? Like I want to imagine a future internet where that's kind of the default for everything that we're doing, that you aren't having to constantly opt out of everything. You're not having to constantly, again, if you have some awareness, you're recognizing all of the things that we, who have an understanding of what security looks like on the internet, what all those implications are, right? Like, so for me, for an end user, you have that entire like opt-in, opt-out model, right? Like that kind of has to be the default behavior when you're thinking about your personal data and how far and wide that gets distributed. And it has to be, like you said, accessible to an end user so they can understand the implications. Because otherwise it's just going to be big and scary, and they're going to try to avoid doing it like taxes or something, right? Like they're just not going to want to engage. And they'll hire someone else. Like, I guess the thing that I keep seeing is, like, I look at my inbox and I see constantly get information about Experian, right? They're trying to sell me this idea of like staying on top of my credit score. My credit score is great. I don't have to worry about it. But there is that idea, like, obviously, if that's a data product that Experian is selling, if you could find a way to get people to understand that there is a social credit score, for lack of a better term, and you can put some metrics or numbers around that, like that's something that you definitely get into a user's mind so they understand the value of their own personal data.
Yeah.
But the problem is,
have you looked into what we're doing with trust?
I'm just jumping. Like I said, I
mean, literally, you just defined the whole blockchain premise we put together is based on trust. It's called the synchronous trust consensus model, and it keeps your social score, your trust value of how well you participated over time. And you actually get your incentive issued to you the higher your trust is.
Yeah, so I read that mechanic in the what was the other paper? It was written, I think, last year, talking about those trust models. Yeah, it seems like a really interesting. I guess for me, it's like I'm used to someone who's like seeing the code, so it's like, okay, how do I implement this on a code level? So without like the big infographics that kind of map out what's going on, it's all very abstract. And so like there's a lot of different ways that these could be implemented. So part of the excitement is seeing how these things become more defined to the point where they become code constructs that I, as a developer, can look at and say, oh, this is how I implement.
So there's two papers
idea.
Released with the algorithms in them. They're published, actually. They're on our website if you need to get to them. But
we hope you have enjoyed this episode of New Cyber Frontier. Remember to get involved. Often we think that someone else will handle privacy and security in the virtual world, but you are the only one truly in command of your virtual fate. Join our mailing list so we can keep you informed of breaking news and new releases. If you have an idea, if you have a question that you would like to hear answered, or if you want to get involved with our efforts, reach out to us at newcyberfrontier.com. We also encourage you to visit our sponsors' links, as they are the ones that really make this show possible. I want to thank each of you for supporting the show, and we look forward to seeing you back for the next episode of New Cyber Frontier.